In a small-town animal shelter, there was a dog everyone feared. His name was Shadow, though no one could say for sure if he even remembered it. When he first arrived, he was little more than a thin, broken creature, a ghost of a dog. His fur was patchy and matted, his ribs clearly visible beneath his skin. His eyes, wide with fear, seemed to reflect a lifetime of pain, loss, and abandonment. No one knew where he had come from or how he ended up on the outskirts of town, but when the shelter staff found him, he was already in a state of desperation. When Shadow was placed in his cage, he immediately began to growl. It wasn't just a warning growl, it was deep, primal, the kind of growl that rattled the walls of the shelter. The other dogs in nearby pens could sense his anger and fear, and they fell silent, sensing the danger that radiated from him. Shadow wasn't just afraid, he was defensive, and no one dared to approach him. His cage was marked with a bold warning: "Do not approach." For the first few days, the shelter staff tried to assess him. They attempted to walk him, but each time, he lunged and snapped at the leash. His movements were erratic, as if he were constantly on edge, expecting an attack. Even the most experienced handlers could not get close. Shadow's behavior was unpredictable, fueled by a deep-seated distrust of humans. The staff whispered about him in hushed tones, and soon, everyone in the shelter had formed their own opinion about Shadow. They believed his aggression was rooted in his past. Perhaps he had been abused. Perhaps he had been abandoned and left to fend for himself in the wilderness. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. Shadow was a dog too broken to be helped. He wasn't just a lost cause, he was a danger. Each day, the volunteers would glance at his cage with a mixture of pity and fear, knowing that there was nothing they could do. Some of them argued that he was beyond saving, that the best thing they could do for him was to put him out of his misery. Shadow had no future at the shelter, and the reality was that his chances of ever finding a loving home seemed slim to none. But even in his broken state, Shadow still had something inside him, something that no one could see. Despite his growls and snarls, there was a deep sadness in his eyes, a plea for help that no one could hear. In his soul, Shadow was still a dog who had known love once, and perhaps, deep down, he still longed for it. As the days passed, the staff began to grow used to the idea that Shadow would never change, that he was destined to live out his days in isolation, feared by everyone who crossed his path. Shadow's reputation at the shelter quickly spread, and soon his cage became a symbol of fear. It wasn't just the workers and volunteers who avoided him. Even the other dogs seemed to sense his hostility. His snarls echoed through the building, cutting through the usual sounds of barking and whimpering like a knife. Each time someone passed his pen, Shadow would lunge forward, eyes flashing with wild fury. His teeth, sharp and yellowed from neglect, glistened as he snapped at the air. The staff had never seen anything like it. They were used to difficult animals, dogs that had been abandoned, mistreated, or simply lost, but none of them had ever encountered one so filled with rage and distrust. Shadow didn't just growl. He was on the offensive from the moment anyone came near. His cage became a kind of warning to anyone who ventured too close. The sign outside it was bold, written in bright red letters: "Do not approach." It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a rule. Shadow had proven time and again that he wouldn't hesitate to defend himself, and his version of defense was not gentle. He would tear into the air with such intensity that the staff were forced to reconsider their usual routines. Even the most experienced handlers would approach his pen cautiously, avoiding eye contact, as if they might trigger some kind of attack. Some days, the staff would stand in front of his cage, watching him with pity and frustration. They could see how unhealthy he was, how his body trembled with every movement, how his ribs stuck out in sharp angles beneath his ragged fur. But they also saw the madness in his eyes, the sheer desperation in the way he barked and snapped. It was as though he had been broken beyond repair. And that's what everyone believed. No one could get through to him. No one could fix the years of suffering and abuse that had shaped him into this creature of rage. At first, there were attempts to comfort him. Some of the volunteers would offer food through the bars, hoping to gain his trust. But Shadow didn't want food. He didn't want comfort. What he wanted, what he needed, was something far more elusive: safety. But in his confused state, he couldn't trust anyone enough to accept it. The truth was clear to the shelter staff. Shadow was beyond help. His aggressive behavior wasn't something they could fix. He was too dangerous, too unpredictable. A small part of them began to wonder if the best thing for him would be to put him down, to end his misery before it could get any worse. But there was always that lingering question: was he really beyond saving? Could a dog like Shadow ever know peace again? The uncertainty weighed heavily on the shelter, but the answer seemed impossible to find. Sophie had always loved animals. From a young age, she developed a deep connection with them, an almost magical ability to sense their emotions. When she walked into the shelter with her father that Saturday morning, she was excited to see the dogs. But unlike the others who hurried past the cages, glancing in with a mix of curiosity and caution, Sophie felt drawn to something more. Her father, a gentleman with a quiet smile, had always taken her to visit animal shelters. But this time was different. They had volunteered there before, helping out on weekends, but today Sophie had one thing on her mind. As she looked down each row of pens, her eyes eventually landed on the one that everyone else avoided. The one with the bold red warning sign: "Do not approach." Her father hesitated when he saw where her gaze was fixed. He knew about Shadow, the dog who had terrified all the volunteers, the one no one dared to help. "Sophie, let's go look at the other dogs," he suggested gently, trying to guide her away. But Sophie didn't move. Instead, she walked right up to the cage, her small fingers curling around the cold bars. Her father watched, worried, unsure of what she was thinking. He'd never seen his daughter act with such determination before. "Daddy," Sophie said quietly, her voice calm and steady, "I want to meet him." Her father's heart skipped a beat. He could see the fear in the dog's eyes, the way Shadow was pacing back and forth, his growls filling the space between them. The dog was dangerous, wasn't he? Surely this wasn't safe. But Sophie didn't seem to notice any of that. She simply sat down, cross-legged on the floor in front of the cage, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't make a sound. She didn't even try to get Shadow's attention. She just sat there, quietly watching him. Shadow, who had been pacing and snarling just moments before, paused when he saw her. His movements slowed. His growls grew quieter. He watched this small, unafraid creature sitting on the cold floor, her wide eyes locked with his. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite understand. For the first time since he had been brought to the shelter, Shadow didn't feel the overwhelming urge to defend himself, to lash out at the unknown. Instead, he stood still, his ears perked, his head tilted as if he was trying to understand why this little girl wasn't afraid of him. Sophie didn't try to touch him or speak. She simply sat there, her presence steady and calm, radiating an unspoken understanding. She wasn't trying to fix him or make him feel better. She just was. And that was enough for Shadow. Minutes passed, but to Sophie, it felt like hours. She never looked away, never flinched. She just kept sitting there, waiting. Sophie's father, unsure of what to do, stood back, watching his daughter, marveling at her quiet courage. He had heard the stories about Shadow, about how vicious and aggressive he was. But in that moment, all he could see was the quiet bond between his daughter and a dog no one else dared to approach. As the days went by, Sophie continued her visits to the shelter. Each time, she would walk straight to Shadow's pen without hesitation. Her father, though initially skeptical, began to understand that Sophie's calm demeanor was doing something the shelter staff hadn't been able to. It was breaking down the walls Shadow had built around himself. Every day, Sophie would sit cross-legged on the cold floor in front of Shadow's cage, her hands resting gently in her lap, her eyes soft and patient. She didn't ask for anything from him. No petting, no interaction. She just offered her presence. The first time, it had seemed like nothing more than a quiet moment between a little girl and a dog. But over time, something more began to happen. At first, Shadow had kept his distance, eyeing Sophie warily from the back of his cage. His growls, though quieter than before, still made the air tense. The sharpness of his barks still echoed in the shelter halls, but Sophie never flinched. She never looked away, and she never moved. Her stillness seemed to create a sense of calm in the otherwise chaotic space. Each visit, Sophie sat there a little longer. Sometimes she would hum a soft tune to herself, and other times she would read aloud from her favorite storybook. Shadow would watch her, his head cocking to the side as if trying to figure out what she was doing. The sound of her voice seemed to soothe him, and for the first time in months, the harsh, defensive growls grew less frequent. One afternoon, after a week of these quiet visits, something remarkable happened. Sophie was sitting as usual when she noticed Shadow standing by the front of his cage, his body stiff, but no longer in attack mode. His eyes, which had once been filled with wild panic, now seemed to carry a faint curiosity. Sophie did not move. She simply looked back at him, her gaze unwavering, and smiled. Shadow took a step forward. The sound of his claws tapping against the concrete floor was the only noise in the room, yet it felt like the loudest thing in the world. Sophie didn't startle, nor did she reach for him. She waited. The tension in the air was palpable. Every time someone had approached Shadow in the past, it had ended in aggression. But Sophie wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid. For a long time, Shadow just stood there, watching her, his breath steady, though still cautious. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he lowered his head and stepped closer to the bars of his pen. Sophie's heart raced, but she remained still, her eyes never leaving his. The space between them felt wide, but the silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was as if, for the first time, they had found a quiet understanding in one another. Sophie didn't try to force anything. She didn't beg for affection, or try to get him to trust her immediately. She simply waited, as patient as a breeze, knowing that with each visit they were getting closer to something neither of them had been able to feel in a long time. Peace. As the weeks passed, Sophie's routine remained the same. Every day after school, she would return to the shelter, her small feet pattering across the floor as she made her way straight to Shadow's pen. She never wavered, never showed any sign of fear. Her visits became a quiet ritual, something she and Shadow shared, even if he couldn't understand it fully. Shadow, on the other hand, began to change. At first, it had been a small shift, an occasional pause in his pacing when Sophie entered, the briefest moment of stillness in his body. But now, there was something more noticeable. When Sophie sat down, Shadow would approach the front of his pen, though not aggressively. He would simply stand there, watching her as if he were processing her every movement. He didn't growl anymore. He didn't snap or bark. Instead, he would tilt his head, his eyes softening as he observed her. It was as if he were learning to trust her in small, gradual steps. Sophie never rushed him. She never tried to pet him or coax him to come closer. She simply sat, offering her presence like a gentle wave in the sea. She spoke to him sometimes, but mostly she would read aloud from her book or hum soft tunes she'd learned from her favorite cartoons. Her calmness was infectious. It spread throughout the space, creating a peaceful atmosphere where Shadow could begin to relax, even if he didn't yet fully understand the sensation. On some days, Sophie would bring a blanket with her. She would spread it on the floor, sitting down on it, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. Shadow, intrigued by the soft texture, would inch closer, his nose sniffing at the edges of the blanket, his paws tapping nervously on the concrete. He wasn't sure what to make of this new, strange thing Sophie had introduced, but he didn't feel the need to react with aggression. Instead, he would observe, his head cocked in curiosity. Over time, the other shelter workers began to notice the subtle changes in Shadow. He had stopped lunging at the bars, and his once constant growls had faded into a low rumble. He was no longer the dog everyone feared. His demeanor had softened, his once frantic energy replaced with a more measured calmness. It was nothing short of miraculous, and they couldn't help but wonder if it was Sophie's quiet presence that had brought about the change. One afternoon, as Sophie sat reading aloud, Shadow did something that no one had expected. He stretched out in front of his pen, his body curling in a relaxed position, and closed his eyes. He didn't flinch when Sophie shifted slightly. He didn't growl or retreat. For the first time, Shadow was at peace, truly at peace, and Sophie, who had never given up on him, smiled softly to herself. She didn't need to touch him or receive anything in return. The bond had already formed, a bond built on time, patience, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you can give is simply being present. It was a rainy afternoon when the breakthrough happened. The shelter was quieter than usual, the soft patter of raindrops against the windows filling the silence. Sophie entered the shelter as she always did, her boots making a gentle tapping sound on the floors as she hurried to Shadow's pen. Her father, who had accompanied her on many of these visits, stayed behind at the entrance, watching her with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Sophie didn't notice the rain or the cold. Her focus was solely on Shadow. Today, something felt different. The connection they had been building over the past few weeks felt stronger, more tangible. As she approached his cage, she noticed Shadow standing near the bars, his large eyes watching her intently. His body was no longer tense, no longer ready to pounce. There was a quiet calm about him, and Sophie's heart warmed at the sight. She didn't sit down immediately this time. Instead, she stood still for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the cage. Shadow's gaze followed her every movement. His ears perked up. Sophie looked into his eyes, her expression soft and steady. She didn't rush, just letting the moment linger in the air between them. It was as though she could feel him considering her, weighing his next move. He was no longer the wild, unpredictable dog he had once been. There was something more vulnerable in his posture now, something that reflected the trust he was beginning to place in her. Without a word, Sophie slowly crouched down, her small hands reaching out toward the bars. She didn't go any further. She waited. Shadow's gaze shifted from her hand to her face, and then, with a cautious but deliberate movement, he took a step forward. He sniffed the air around her outstretched fingers, his large nose twitching as he processed her scent. The tension in his body was still present, but it wasn't the fearful, aggressive tension it had once been. Now, it was something else, a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Sophie's heart beat a little faster, but she remained still. She didn't try to touch him, to coax him, or to rush him. She simply gave him space, trusting him to come to her when he was ready. Shadow stood there for what felt like an eternity, sniffing her fingers carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. The air was thick with the unspoken understanding between them, a quiet promise that for once, no one was going to hurt the other. Then, after a long moment, something incredible happened. Shadow's nose gently brushed against her hand. It wasn't a sharp jab or an aggressive move. It was tentative, soft, as if he were testing the waters, unsure of what to expect but willing to trust the little girl who had never given up on him. Sophie smiled, her fingers remaining still. She didn't pull away or flinch. She just let him explore, letting Shadow know that it was okay, that she was not going to hurt him, that she was not like the others. Shadow stayed there for several more moments, his nose pressed gently against her hand, before he slowly stepped back, his body relaxing for the first time in what seemed like forever. Sophie's smile grew wider as she watched him, her heart full. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to force anything. She had earned his trust, and Shadow had taken the first step toward healing, all because of the quiet patience of a little girl who refused to give up on him. You said. From that day forward, Sophie's visits became the highlight of Shadow's days. The bond between them had solidified in a way that no one at the shelter had ever expected. Shadow, who had once been a symbol of fear and aggression, now waited eagerly for Sophie to arrive. His body, once tense and defensive, had softened, and his eyes, once wild with panic, were now filled with curiosity and, at times, affection. The shelter workers noticed the change too. They saw how Shadow would stand by the front of his pen as Sophie approached, his tail giving a small, tentative wag. It was a subtle gesture, but to those who knew the dog's history, it was nothing short of miraculous. No one had ever imagined that Shadow could become so calm, so gentle, especially not after everything he had been through. Sophie had become his anchor. In a world that had once been filled with loud noises and sharp edges, she was his calm, his peace. She was the one who had shown him that not all humans were to be feared, that kindness and patience could heal wounds that ran deep. And in return, Sophie had discovered something profound as well. She had learned that love didn't always need to be forced. Sometimes, the greatest connections were the ones that unfolded quietly, in their own time. One afternoon, Sophie sat in front of Shadow's pen, as she always did, but today there was a new energy in the air. Sophie had brought her father with her, hoping he would see just how far Shadow had come. For the first time, she was going to try something she had never dared before. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Shadow. He watched her closely, his body poised but not tense. Sophie took a deep breath and, with a steady hand, opened the latch of the cage. She didn't rush, didn't make any sudden movements. She simply stood there, waiting, as if asking for permission. Shadow's eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. There was no growl, no snap. He didn't lunge at the bars. He simply looked at her, his expression calm, as though he were processing the offer she had given him. Sophie's heart raced, but she remained composed, her hand steady. She took a step back and slowly extended her arm, just enough so that Shadow could decide if he wanted to come out. The decision was his, and Sophie knew that no matter what happened, she would respect it. To everyone's astonishment, Shadow didn't hesitate. He took a cautious step forward, his large paws moving slowly across the concrete floor of his pen. It was as if he were testing the world outside, unsure but willing to trust. As he crossed the threshold of the pen, Sophie crouched down to his level, her voice soft and soothing. "You're safe, Shadow. You're okay now," she whispered, her hand gently reaching out towards him. For the first time, in what seemed like forever, Shadow was free. Free from the cage. Free from the fear that had held him captive for so long. And with that first step, he walked into the unknown, not with aggression, but with the quiet courage of a dog who had finally found the one person who believed in him when no one else did. "You said." Shadow's first steps outside his cage were tentative, almost as if he was unsure of what freedom truly meant. He had been confined to that small space for so long, bound by the fear and distrust that had once ruled his every action. But as he stepped into the open area of the shelter, his body relaxed. His tail, which had once been tucked tightly between his legs in fear, gave a slow, tentative wag. Sophie stood there, her eyes wide with wonder and hope as she watched the dog she had come to love take those first few steps into a new life. Her father, standing a few feet behind her, couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for his daughter. What Sophie had done for Shadow was nothing short of remarkable. She had broken through the barriers he had built around himself, and now she was witnessing the beginning of his healing. Shadow moved slowly, his large paws making soft sounds against the floor. He wasn't sure what to make of this new space, but there was something different about it. The air felt freer, lighter. The space was vast, and for the first time, he didn't feel trapped. Sophie, though, remained calm and patient. She didn't push him to do anything. She simply stood there, watching him with an understanding that went beyond words. For a long while, Shadow explored the area in small, deliberate steps. He sniffed at the ground, his nose twitching as he took in the new scents. He wasn't rushing, wasn't darting from one corner to another. He was simply allowing himself to be in the moment, allowing himself to experience the world in a way he had never been able to before. It was as if he was learning to trust his surroundings for the first time, not through fear, but through quiet exploration. Sophie sat down on the ground, her legs crossed, just like she always had when she visited him in his pen. She watched as Shadow moved around her, his pace still cautious, but less frantic. Every now and then, he would look up at her, as though checking that she was still there, still offering her quiet support. "Good boy, Shadow," Sophie said softly, her voice full of warmth. She didn't need to say more. Shadow already knew. The bond they shared had become something deeper than just an animal and a girl. It was a silent understanding, a trust that neither of them had ever known before. Sophie had shown him kindness when everyone else had given up on him, and in return, Shadow had shown her the power of patience and love. As the afternoon wore on, Shadow began to move with more confidence. He no longer hesitated at every turn. He trotted a few steps away from Sophie, his tail wagging a little more freely now. He sniffed at a patch of grass, exploring the new world around him with a sense of wonder. It was a small victory, but to Sophie and her father, it felt monumental. By the time they left the shelter that day, the air between them felt lighter. Shadow, the dog who had once been feared by everyone, had begun his journey toward healing. He wasn't completely free of his past, but he was no longer the same frightened creature who had hidden behind the bars of his cage. He had learned to trust again, and in doing so, he had opened the door to a new life. Sophie knew that there was still much more to be done. There would be ups and downs, setbacks and progress. But for the first time in a long while, she felt certain of one thing. Shadow had found his second chance, and with her by his side, there was nothing he couldn't overcome. Together, they had changed each other's lives, and this was only the beginning.